Mr. Speaker, members, this is the omnibus supplemental bill, and I would appreciate members. I'm going to move that the DEA 4099 amendment so that we can substitute the House language into the Senate bill.
Representative Knobloch, then it is your intention to replace the House language before you present the bill?
It is, and that is a procedural motion. I'd appreciate people's support.
Clerk will report the amendment.
Knobloch moves to amend Senate File Number 3656, the second engrossment, as follows. Delete everything after the enacting clause and insert the following language of House File 4099, the first engrossment.
Discussion to the amendment. Seeing none, all those in favor of adoption of the amendment signify by saying aye. Aye. All opposed, no. Motion prevails. The amendment is adopted. Representative Knobloch, to your bill as amended.
Members, the bill as amended actually contains four omnibus bills. It contains agriculture, contains environment, contains state government finance, contains jobs. It also contains some obsolete language deletions, which is the base of the original bill. If you're looking for those, they're on page 261, lines 4 and 5 and 15 and 16. Delete some obsolete language related to buffers from last year. With that, members, I would like to yield to Representative Anderson P. to discuss the agriculture part of the bill.
I recognize the member from Pope, Representative Anderson.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker and members. And the leading off today is the Agriculture Finance Bill. And before I get too far into it, I'd like to thank a lot of those folks that helped to work on this bill. First of all, thanks to Representative Hamilton for his outstanding work on this finance bill. Also to Vice Chair Miller, who worked on the bill. Lead DFL Representative Poppy, thank you for your work on this finance bill. The committee administrator, Mark Nisley, the nonpartisan staff, Colby Sullivan, the fiscal analyst, Ken Savory, the CLA, Rachel Buckholtz, and the DFL researcher, Nancy Connolly. So thanks to those folks for their work on the Ag Finance Bill. Mr. Speaker and members, we didn't have a large budget target. $250,000 was the target for this bonding year, additional funding for the Ag Finance Bill. We chose to use that funding in a couple of different ways. A major portion, about $220,000, going to help increase mental health work among farmers in Minnesota. Currently, we have one person who covers the entire state and offers his services to help farmers dealing with this financial crisis, things going on in agriculture. And this bill would apply additional funding to help get one more staff person who is specializing in mental health to kind of cover the northern half of the state and to help farmers deal with this financial crisis we're seeing in agriculture. The other $30,000 in funding is a Representative Poppy provision that would go to the Department of Ag to increase their program in the Farm Advocate Services Program. Again, that's a one-on-one program where these folks have experience and they'll deal with farmers experiencing technical issues, financial issues, things like that. Another good program to help farmers in these tough times. The other major spending portion of this bill provides $35 million to the Rural Finance Authority. We gave them bonding authority last year, but again, because of the financial situation in agriculture, that funding is rapidly decreasing and is nearly extinguished. So they have asked for additional funding. Additionally, they had asked for $20 million, but the need is so great that we have increased that with the governor's support as well to $35 million additional bonding authority for the Department of Ag and the RFA program. Other provisions in the bill, a provision by Chair Hamilton to change the definitions in the forestry biomass program to allow a company that began production prior to 2015 to be eligible for the program if there's funding available, funding left from the other companies that are being helped in this forestry biomass program. The Representative Backer provision would extend the commission called the AFRAC program, which stands for the Agricultural Research and Education Council, which again deals with research in the very important area of fertilizer and containing it to where it should be, staying on the field. Very important work done by this AFREC Council. That was due to expire in 2019. This provision would extend that sunset by 10 years. And this is a self-funding program that is paid for by farmers themselves with a 40-cent per ton fee on each ton of fertilizer they purchase, which goes to that research. I had a provision in the bill that dealt with kind of a unique situation, an off-sale liquor store that gets a license from the Department of Ag to sell ice that they make on premises. And because of a change, the license fee was increased by something like 900% because the department had to start using their entire gross sales amount when figuring the cost of that license. What this provision does, again, is go back to just using the revenue generated by their ice sales to determine their license cost with the Department of Agriculture. No change in the testing or regulations, just a decrease in the cost of their license. Another provision by Representative Backer that modifies eligibility for the bioincentive program. It clarifies some definitions and says that the source of the biomass should be within 100 miles of the plant or from within Minnesota. And the next provision by Representative Clark deals with eligibility for the Ag Microloan Program and some definitions modified dealing with aquaculture pertaining to specialty crops and livestock. And the next provision is a department provision that would allow municipalities to apply for loans from the Department of Agriculture if they want to study the possibility of a loan for an energy feasibility study. They'd be eligible now to get part of that help from the department with a loan in that program. And the last provision in the bill, Mr. Speaker, is the provision dealing with the nitrogen fertilizer rule. And what the provision says, we've heard this before in the House floor, is that when the Department of Ag finishes its work dealing with the nitrogen rule, it simply has to come back here probably next January, next session, for final approval before that nitrogen rule would go into effect. That, Mr. Speaker, is the bill, and with that I will yield to Chair Fabian to deal with the next part of this bill today. Thanks, Mr. Speaker.
Recognize the member from Roseau, Representative Fabian.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Well, members, we have before us the Environment and Natural Resources portion of the bill. Before I start, I'd like to thank the members of the Environment Committee, especially Representative Hornstein, who's leaving. No, I'm just teasing you a little bit. Minority Lead Hansen and my Vice Chair, Representative Heinzman, all the DFL and GOP members. We try to run an enjoyable committee, a respectful committee. And before I go any further, too, I have to thank the really, really smart people. As you all know, our staff is incredible around here. Janelle Taylor, Bob Eliff, and Brad Hagemeyer. And our partisan staff, Peter Strohmeyer, Harry Miracle, Karen Johnson, and Amy Zipko. Amazing team that we have. We had a $750,000 general fund target, and we expressed my concern for the CWD. All of the money that we had in our general fund target was directed towards the DNR to continue battling the CWD situation that we have, allowing for them to do more testing and enforcement. We've dedicated accounts at DNR at a few projects that we have funded. Representative Lewick has got $50,000 from the Heritage Enhancement account to do a report for recommendations on improving the health of natural wild rice beds. We've got a number of members who have issues here regarding snowmobiles and ATVs, Representative Eklund and Metza and Heinzman and Lewick. We got $1.4 million from the ATV off-road vehicle accounts for work on numerous projects such as the Prospectors Loop and the Voyager County and Taconite Trails, Voyager Country, and Taconite Trails. We got $319,000 from the Mineral Management account to continue mineral research that helps the DNR in permitting decisions related to mining. And members, we have a number of different types of mining practices in the state that we're working on, and I think that in a natural resource-based economy, mining is extremely important. Also incorporated in this bill are several other policy provisions from members on both sides of the aisle, as well as many provisions from the state agencies. Representative Fenton has the creation of the account within the remediation fund for the MPCA 3M settlement. Representative Bliss has this prohibition on the MPCA from raising their water fees without legislative approval. Representative Nash has a provision in here. It's an educational piece regarding to reducing carbon monoxide exposure to people in ice houses. And I know that we have some people here that I think will be recognized in a little bit who are instrumental in that. Several regulatory reform measures, including Representative Backer's exemption from fugitive dust standards for temporary commodity storage facilities. Representative Torkelson has got language in here that codifies in statute the language from MPCA Commissioner Stein's memo regarding external peer review practices for water quality standards. Representative Lewick has his regulatory certainty for wastewater treatment facilities when they do upgrades to comply with new or modified effluent limits. I have some language in here putting into statute the agreement from last year regarding the dedication of the deer fee increase on your deer licenses, increasing money going into the deer management account from just $2 up to $16, which is roughly 50% of the fee total. Representative Fisher assured me he's voting for the bill. I'm teasing. He's got some language in here on coordinated watershed management, which is updates to the Clean Water Legacy Act and some local watershed management programs, and will provide more flexibility and support for local actions. Representative New has got some language in here that I know that many of you are familiar with, and if you ever went back and watched the tape of the testimony that was given on the DWI laws regarding snowmobiles, ATVs, and boats, it was very compelling. Representative Sandstead has got language in here regarding the Hill Annex Mine State Park. Representative Anselmo has got some language in here with regards to the salt applicator policies that are in here. And I've also got language in here regarding the 404 permitting if you do anything with road projects and so forth. You know, this is a big concern for a lot of people. We're trying to continue the process of taking back from the federal government the 404 permitting here at the state level. And we're just extending the timeline available for using those funds. Honestly, folks, we really tried to work together as a group, as a committee, to find common ground, dealing with issues on both sides of the aisle. This is a good bill and will help people throughout the state, but particularly those who live in and enjoy the greater outdoors in the greater Minnesota. And I thank you for your support. And with that, I would like to yield to Representative Detmer.
I recognize the member from Washington, Representative Detmer.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And as people know, I chair the Veterans Division, and we have some excellent components of this bill for our veterans around the state of Minnesota. The Senate file contains $26 million in funding for our stadium reserve, from our stadium reserve account, for the construction of 3 new veterans homes in Bemidji, Montevideo, and Preston. And I'd like to thank Representative Bliss, Representative Crosell, Representative Miller, and Representative Davids for bringing these bills forward to the division, Veterans Division. And we've worked about a total between these 3 communities, we've worked about 20 years in getting this information forward and get it to the position where we are at today on the House floor. The people of these veterans homes, and we need new homes for our veterans. The Vikings already have a home, and now we got to be thinking about the areas of the state that our veterans are so in need of homes. And for some of you, the veterans and their families in and around these communities deserve to have a veterans home nearby so that the family members can get to their veteran that is staying in these homes. And members, for most veterans that are in our 5 veterans homes, this is their last mission. They will come into the homes. Most of the ones that are in our homes now, our 5 veterans homes that we have around the state, are World War II veterans. And we could probably say in the next 10 years, that generation will leave us. Followed by the Korean War veterans, and now we're going to be seeing our Vietnam War veterans entering our homes. And if you've read recently Congress has authorized nearly $700 million to the U.S. Department of Veterans Affairs for our state veterans' homes. For their construction, there's a grant program. It's the largest appropriation, members, it's the largest appropriations that Congress has done for our veterans' homes. Nearly $700 million just appropriated. Minnesota currently federal authorized us 1,058 beds. That's what the federal VA authorizes Minnesota, 1,058 beds. We currently have 824 beds. Minneapolis, we have 350. Laverne, 85. Hastings, 200. Fergus Falls, 106. Silver Bay, 83. That's a total of 824. By building these 3 veterans' homes in Bemidji, Montevideo, and Preston, that would give us another 216 beds for our veterans. That will give us 1,040 beds, still under the 1,058 beds that the federal VA has given to Minnesota, or allowed us to have. I say currently this capacity is because the federal government will recalculate these bed numbers and bed authorization after the next census count, which you know is coming up. The Minnesota bed count authorization may change. It could be increased or it could be decreased. So now is the time to act, members. Now is the time to act. The Senate File 3656 also contains provisions for a bill I authored for low-income housing project at Fort Snelling Upper Post. And members, this type of housing is not going to cost our taxpayers. We heard this proposal in the Veterans Division, and Governor Dayton, MMMB, Commissioner Myron Franz, members of the Minnesota Congressional Delegation, and many others support this project in the Fort Snelling Upper Post. You know, members, traveling the state and talking about the addition of these 3 homes, I think we were out on the western part of the state, and Chair Anderson, we had an open mic where people could come up and talk about these facilities that we are proposing. And a World War II veteran came up and he grabbed the mic, well-spoken, and he sat down and he said, by the time this veterans home is built in my community, I won't be around. He's in his mid-90s. But then he said something that really stuck with me. He said that it's not for me, he said, it's for the veterans coming behind me. And I will always remember that statement by the World War II veteran. My father is 95 years old and is a World War II veteran, still lives in his home. He's fortunate. He has the health that he can stay in his home. As I mentioned before, the veterans that are living in our 5 homes right now, that's their last mission in life. And members, our young veterans now that are currently serving in our armed forces, they're watching us. They are watching us. They want to see how we treat our veterans, because they will be someday in the same situation with our veterans' homes. They're watching. The young ones are watching us. And we can say that the character of a state or character of a nation can really be evaluated how well we treat our veterans. And members, Mr. Speaker, I would like to now yield to Chair Anderson S.
I recognize the member from Hennepin, Representative Anderson S.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Members, I just want to do a few thank yous before I go into the description of the bill. I'm fortunate to work with a wonderful staff and with wonderful members on the State Government Finance Committee. First, want to extend my thanks to Shirley Cotterick, John Hultquist, Brian Cook. I also want to thank DFL staff, Jim Geldman, our nonpartisan staff, Matt Gearing and Helen Roberts, who all work very hard to make sure that as members we have the information we need to make some very serious decisions here at the Capitol. I also want to extend my thanks to all of my committee members that serve on the committee. Especially want to say thanks to Representative Bob Detmer, who takes care of the Veterans Division. And also want to say thanks to Representative Liz Olson, who stepped in a pinch when Representative Sheldon Johnson became ill. Appreciate her work and the questions that she has as part of that committee. We're down 2 members so far, Representative Sheldon Johnson and Representative Lilly. I swear I have nothing to do with that. So I hope both of them get well and are back here soon. Folks, as far as the bill itself, we do a couple of different things. As Representative Detmer pointed out, we have an opportunity here today to do some really good work for the veterans who have dedicated their lives to our freedom that we have, our ability to be here on this House floor and to have this discussion. We can have these $26 million out of this bill is dedicated out of the Stadium Reserve Fund. When you look at these reserve funds, they are the excess of the excess. It is the frosting that doesn't fit on the cake, folks, and we are putting those dollars to better use. We are making sure that we're taking care of our veterans. But on top of that, we also take care of a priority that's near and dear to the governor's heart, and that is establishing a sexual harassment office for our state employees. So we have that funded also out of the state stadium reserve, the Vikings Stadium Reserve. So those are 2 of the top 2 provisions of this legislation. We also look at efforts to streamline state government. We have a couple of reform items here. I want to talk first about in the MNLARS issue. We gave them $10 million here earlier in the legislative session in the hopes that they would be able to get a better handle on our licensed vehicle title and registration issue that we're having with the state. As part of that, we want to make sure that there's accountability. So we have some accountability measures that are a part of this legislation. We also have some provisions that were added in the Ways and Means Committee that were authored by Representative Marquardt and Representative Poppe. One dealing with the issue on the state auditor in the recent court case that voted in favor of the legislature, that we had the constitutional opportunity to do what we did. And then also taking care of the city of Austin and some pension issues that they were dealing with. In addition to that, we have legislation in here that puts in place the cap on transfers to the governor's office. The cap was in place until about 2011, 2012 at about $720,000. This cap was about the governor taking funds from other state agencies and transferring to his office. Since that 2011, 2012, that governor's office has transferred a total of $2 million this year alone. And so we want to put that cap back in place at around the $750,000 mark to make sure that we're keeping our agencies whole. As far as other priorities that are part of this legislation, I mentioned the Veterans Homes, the Sexual Harassment Office. We also have some legislation here dealing with the issue of cybersecurity. Representative Jim Nash has worked very hard on this issue. We're going to make sure that agencies are making cybersecurity a priority by making sure that they set aside funds as part of their budget for IT functions, that is part of their priorities. We also have some language as part of the legislation to make sure that the Secretary of State has cybersecurity centered on our voting system. We're able to capitalize on federal government giving us $6.9 million in exchange for us putting $220,000, which I think is a pretty good exchange for that. We have some language in the bill, some funding for the program that Representative Mariani has supported in the past. This is on the reading program for children to help them read. And we also have a provision for Representative Crecia that he's worked on, helping to help teachers become better educators on economics in high schools and elementary. Some other provisions that are in the bill, Representative Roz Peterson carried the legislation making public subsidy fair across the board for all candidates, and I think that's a great revision to how we handle things on the campaign finance side of things. Representative Vogel has worked very hard on the Legislative Budget Office, getting this established. This is something that both the House and the Senate on a bipartisan basis have worked towards. This office will finally give the legislature their own budget office that will help us understand when we put out legislation what the fiscal impact will be to the state. I think that's a great measure that he's put in place. Other provisions that are included in the bill, we've got Representative Rena Moran has the hair braiders repeal language as part of this legislation, and Representative Flanagan has the provision on the eyelash repeal too. What we found in dealing with these two issues is that it was penalizing these small business, primarily women-owned businesses, and we want to track that back so that we're not penalizing folks that are trying to do good work for and be good business owners. Other provisions that are in the bill, two of them that I've carried, it's the dealing with the issue of the stadium suites. As you heard last year, there was abuse of the use of the stadium suites by the MSFA board. What we're doing is we're putting guardrails in place for whoever is there for the future to make sure that this asset, the state asset of ours, is never abused in the future again. On top of that, we're capitalizing on the fact that we have 3 suites that we ultimately do not need to have that many of suites. So we want to repurpose those suites and then take the revenue from that and have that go towards paying down the debt on the stadium so we can pay off the stadium debt faster, which I think is a good reform in place. Then also another measure of mine is dealing with redistricting. Folks, every 10 years when we're dealing with the redistricting issue, we do not have principles in place. It is up to the legislature at that time to adopt a set of principles. And then if the legislature doesn't get a bill that is signed into law by the governor, then we run into the problem that it goes to the court. We already have a system where the court is the default if the legislature and the governor's office can't agree on a redistricting plan. And then the court decides what the principles are. I think it's important for us to have these principles in place as a guide to the courts so they don't have to determine their own principles. These principles in themselves prevent gerrymandering. These principles say that you have to have contiguous districts. You cannot have all these squiggly line districts that you've seen in these other states. You can't have that. It also makes sure that you cannot pack minorities and you can't crack minority areas. So it's all the general standard principles that every good governance has, and we're putting those into state statute to make sure that they're here now and forever. Lastly, I just want to highlight one other provision that's part of this bill. Representative Albright worked very hard on the Met Council and getting the reforms. He's done work on this for several years on a bipartisan basis. I think this is a great reform measure, and happy to carry that provision as part of this bill. There are a lot of other great provisions in this bill, but knowing that I don't want to tax your patience. So members, appreciate your time, and I yield to Representative Garofalo.
The member from Dakota, Representative Garofalo.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and members, and like others before, I want to say thank you to our exceptional nonpartisan staff in the jobs, energy, and housing arena. We are truly blessed to have exceptional staff with not only success in the legislature, but also outside of it. I want to thank 2010 Olympic gold medalist Anna Shalene for her work, Time Magazine's 2006 Man of the Year Ben Weeks, Grammy Award-winning recording artist Bob Eloff, and as well as Nobel Prize winner for economics Chris Zempel. They all do an exceptional job working on our nonpartisan staff. Also, for the partisan staff, I want to thank Dr. Bill Glahn, Adam Seidel, on the DFL side, Dave Sullivan, and the most patient committee legislative assistant in the Minnesota House of Representatives, Amelia Ellard. So, Mr. Speaker and members, what you have before us is the jobs, energy, and housing provisions. This bill is $15 million above base. Every single penny of that amount goes into broadband expansion. Yay. So we got more money going into broadband. Beyond that, there are priorities that the committee has funded in terms of job training, in terms of making sure that we have water infrastructure projects that are of a high priority in members' districts. But every single one of those projects is paid for by cutting other areas of government. And the committee felt very strongly that at a time when unemployment in our state is at 3.2%, the feedback we're getting from the business community, from nonprofit groups and others is that it's better, instead of taking those dollars and putting them into corporate subsidies, into businesses, we're much better off repurposing those dollars and instead putting them into job training programs, water infrastructure programs, and other high priorities. There's some other important policy changes outside the general fund that are taking place. So at this time, I will yield to Representative Barr C. from Anoka, and he'll talk about some of the exciting areas that are taking place in energy that are sort of a win-win for the state of Minnesota.
I recognize the member from Anoka, Representative Barr C.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker and members. The Renewable Development Account is funded by cask fees from the spent nuclear rods, fuel rods at the nuclear power plants in the state of Minnesota. They're currently charged on a per cask fee, and we've changed that to a flat fee per year, which will result in a $300 million savings to Xcel Energy electricity ratepayers over the current licensing for those nuclear power plants. That still leaves money in the Renewable Development Account for the Prairie Island Indian community to receive $40 million to convert to a zero emissions community, which will be the first in the nation. And with that, I yield my time to Representative Garofalo.
Representative Garofalo.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Members, also in the area of housing, there's some exciting changes, rules changes. So at this time, I'll yield the floor to the member from Scott, Representative Vogel.
I recognize the member from Scott, Representative Vogel.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Last year, we had a lengthy debate on housing regulation, residential housing regulation, and I went back to work and put together a new bill that is included in the omnibus bill. And what this does, differently than last year, is it doesn't mandate that the legislature has to approve the regulations. What it says is that we have to be notified. But more importantly, it has information in there that says that the different agencies can work in combining, rather than being silos, in combining their efforts to bring regulation to make it more affordable. So as you look at the bill, I'd have you center your attention on subdivision 2, where it talks about agencies working together to make housing more affordable. And I'd yield back to Chair Garofalo.
Representative Garofalo.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And finally, I'll yield the floor to Representative from Anoka, Representative West, who's going to talk about some of the changes we made in affordable housing to provide more housing options for those who are seeking affordable housing in our state.
Recognize the member from Anoka, Representative West.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker and members. I had two housing provisions in the bill for manufactured housing. One repeals an obsolete rule that prevented modular homes from being placed in manufactured housing parks if there's no city ordinance and the manufactured housing part actually wants it. This is a good reform that allows more choices and options for people who choose to live in this incredibly affordable arena in the housing industry. And then also a governor's provision that I also carried was increasing the Manufactured Housing Relocation Trust Fund from $1 million to $3 million. This will allow, it was almost depleted this last year, so this increase will ensure that if there is a park closure, there will be money available for these individuals who have to relocate because their park is closing. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Representative Garofalo.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Members, and again, members have the spreadsheets in front of them. You'll see that there are several DFL policy as well as funding priorities contained in the bill, as well as those of the GOP side. And I want to thank members of the committee for their strong support of the two-tiered minimum wage, particularly for the Restaurant Workers of America who came in and made the case to members of the committee explaining how they wanted their high-wage jobs to be preserved. They did not want to see their jobs replaced with lower-wage, counter-service model restaurants. And so there's very strong argument before the committee that people felt very positive about. So, Mr. Speaker, at this point, I'll yield back the floor to Chairman Knobloch.
Representative Knobloch.
Well, Mr. Speaker, members, you've heard the description of the bill. Before we go to amendments and discussion to the bill, I want to thank the chairs who have spoken and been involved in putting together this particular bill. Chair Paul Anderson, Rod Hamilton, Chair Fabian, Chair Sarah Anderson, and Chair Garofalo, who you just have heard from. I'd also like to thank the members of the Ways and Means Committee. We'll be certainly talking about other Ways and Means issues in the coming weeks here, but it seems like a good, appropriate time to recognize those members, and particularly Minority Lead Lyndon Carlson. And finally, I do want to thank our staff, Gene Coddington, my my legislative assistant, who's done such a good job on the committee, Harry Kennedy, the new committee administrator this year, who has done the job before and stepped forward to do it again when we needed him. I want to thank Bill Marks, our nonpartisan fiscal staff, who everyone knows and has worked here for so many decades to keep things on the straight and narrow, shall we say, on the accounting side. Colby Sullivan, our counsel, as well as the DFL Research and House Research, Bill Glahn, and the others who are involved as well in terms of our pages. So with that, Mr. Speaker, members, I turn it back to amendments or debate.